The blizzard had been trying to kill Dirk Voss for 11 hours. He knew this because his suit's clock was the only thing still working at full capacity, and it told him the storm had rolled off the Karanova Ridge at 3:14 local time, and it was now 14:23, and the wind outside the emergency shelter hab was reading a sustained 63 kilometers per hour with gusts topping 90. The hab's thermal shell had stopped generating heat 4 hours ago when the fuel cell cracked. He knew this too. He'd checked it 17 times in the first hour and stopped checking after that because the number didn't change, and looking at broken things too long made a man start to feel like a broken thing himself. Dirk Voss was 31 years old. He was an outpost maintenance technician for Caldera Mining Consortium, stationed at Survey Point Curl 7 on the moon Tavon, which orbited a gas giant called Rendeth 4 at the far end of the Jivith corridor. Tavon was technically habitable, breathable atmosphere, acceptable gravity, no native megafauna, but its axial tilt combined with Rendeth 4 eccentric orbit produced weather systems that could go from calm to lethal in under 2 hours. He had been warned about this during orientation. He had signed a waiver. He had been on Tavon for 14 months without incident, which was exactly the kind of record that preceded a very serious incident. The hab was rated for a crew of 4. It was currently housing 1 human, which meant there were 3 empty bunks, 3 untouched emergency ration packs, and 3 thermal blankets that Dirk had already layered over himself and which were doing a disappointing job. The hab's shell was stopping the wind. It was not stopping the cold. The floor registered at -11 Celsius and dropping. His breath came in small clouds that hung in the still air before dissolving. He was wearing every piece of clothing he owned, which amounted to 2 base layers, a work coverall, and a maintenance jacket rated to -20, which sounded like more than enough until you realized that rating assumed you had a functioning heat source and weren't planning to spend the night. He was not planning to spend the night. He also did not have a choice. His crawler had gone into the ravine 300 meters east when a snow shelf collapsed under it. The collapse had given him about 4 seconds of warning, a sound like someone tearing a very large sheet of paper, then the lurch of the ground deciding to be elsewhere, and he'd gotten out the side door and onto solid rock, while the crawler was still tilted at 45 degrees, which was the kind of thing that looked impressive in the telling and felt only like raw animal urgency in the living. He'd watched from the ridge as the crawler settled nose down into the ravine with a resignation that big machines had when they accepted they were stuck. The crawler was not destroyed. The crawler would probably be fine once someone came with a winch. The crawler was currently not doing him any good. He'd reached the hab on foot in weather that reduced visibility to less than 30 meters, navigating by the signal from the hab's beacon on his wrist unit, which was the contingency he'd been trained for, and which he was profoundly grateful he'd paid attention to during that particular training session. The hab was 200 meters northwest of the ravine. He'd covered it in a run that was technically a run, and functionally, a controlled stumble through wind that kept trying to explain to him, physically, what it meant when a Category 4 event told you to stay inside. His comm signal was being swallowed by the storm. His emergency beacon was transmitting, but the response from base camp had come back as a terse automated message: weather event Category 4 in progress. Rescue operations suspended pending clearance. Estimated 1824 HRS. He'd read that message 5 times and then put his comm unit face down on the bunk beside him so he wouldn't read it a 6th time. The message didn't change when you read it again. He knew this. He'd still been tempted to read it again. So, 1 man, 1 broken hab, -11 on the floor getting colder, 18 to 24 hours until anyone came. He'd done the math. He didn't like the math. He pulled the thermal blankets tighter and started running through the survival checklist in his head the way his training instructor had drilled into him, the one who'd survived a Category 5 on Duran 2 and had never quite lost the look in his eyes that came from that. Shelter, check. Insulation, working on it, heat source. Negative, water, sufficient, food, sufficient, air, fine, heat source, still negative. The heat source was the problem. It kept coming back to the heat source. He was inventorying the HAB storage cabinet for the fourth time, hoping he'd missed something useful, when the HAB door opened. Not blew open, not failed. Opened from the outside, the way a door opens when someone grabs the handle and turns it, deliberate and purposeful. Derek had his maintenance wrench in his hand before the door was fully open, which he acknowledged later was not a rational response to a storm on an uninhabited moon, but which also felt absolutely correct in the moment. He was on his feet, back against the far wall, wrench raised, when the figure came through the door and sealed it behind them. It was not a person he recognized. It was not, for that matter, a person in any sense he had a clean category for. She stood perhaps a centimeter shorter than him, which put her around 175 centimeters, and she was wearing what might have been clothing or might have been an exoskeletal layer, something dark and form-fitting that moved with her like a second skin rather than sitting on top of it. Her proportions were close to human, very close. Bilateral symmetry, 2 arms, 2 legs, upright stance, head at the top. But the skin on the back of her hand where she'd pushed back her hood was a deep amber brown with a faint iridescence that shifted toward gold when she moved through his suit lamp's cone of light, and her eyes were the color of dark honey and slightly too large for a human face, with pupils that were dilated wide against the dimness of the HAB and showed no white at their edges. Her hair was short and dark and still shedding crystals of ice. At her throat, knotted tight, was a thin cord of deep blue material that stood out against her skin, with a deliberateness that suggested it was not decorative. She looked at him and his maintenance wrench with an expression that was somewhere between irritation and the specific kind of studied neutrality that people adopt when they are consciously deciding not to be afraid. Then she said something. It was not any language Derek spoke. It was melodic in structure, falling tones followed by a rising glottal stop, and she said it with the brisk directness of someone relaying information rather than making a request. He stared at her. She stared back. She said the same thing again, slightly louder, with what might have been added emphasis on the second syllable. Derek lowered the wrench a few centimeters. I don't understand you. She blinked, long blinks slower than human. Then she said something else shorter, and crossed to the storage cabinet he'd been ransacking and opened it with the confidence of someone who had been in this kind of HAB before, or had done enough reconnaissance to know the layout, and began checking its contents. She pulled out a fuel cell, the backup, the one he hadn't been able to fit to the cracked housing, turned it over in her hands, examined the connector end, set it down. She looked at the cracked housing on the HAB's heat unit and made a sound. Short, percussive. He was almost certain it was a profanity. Yeah, he said. I tried it, the thread stripped. She glanced at him, not with surprise exactly, more like recalibration. He held up the fuel cell and then pointed at the broken housing and made a gesture that he hoped communicated I know, I already tried. She looked at his hands, looked at the housing, and then went to her knees in front of it and began to work on it with her fingers, and he realized her hands were wrong in a small way. Her fingers were one joint longer than his past the last knuckle, which gave them a reach and a leverage that his didn't have. She was doing something to the threading that he hadn't been able to do. He watched her work. She didn't look up. Outside, the wind spiked to one of its 90-kilometer gusts, and the HAB groaned and held, which it was built to do. Her hands moved steadily, unhurried, with the focused calm of a person who has done precise work in bad conditions before. I'm Derek, he said. He pointed at his own chest as he said it the way you did. She looked up, considered him, said a word, one syllable, a soft consonant at the front, a long mid-vowel. Is that your name? She held his gaze for a beat and then went back to the threading. He took that as a yes. I'm going to call you May, he said. Is that okay? She did not respond. He decided that meant it was okay. She got the housing threaded in 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock the way he'd been watching it all day, a habit that was hard to break when time was the variable that mattered most. She worked without speaking, without looking to him for help, without giving any indication that the cold was bothering her. Her hands moved through the task with a confidence that was not hurry, each movement precise, considered, wasting nothing. He watched her and thought about the word asterisk competent, and how it was one of the most attractive qualities a person could have, and how rarely it was acknowledged as such. She seated the fuel cell, pressed something on the unit's side that he hadn't pressed, a recessed switch under a panel he hadn't noticed, hidden under a secondary access cover that he'd apparently read as decorative. And the heat unit made a sound like a kettle deciding to try again, a low building hum that climbed through 3 registers before settling, and then a warm orange glow came up from the element and heat began to move through the hab. It moved through his feet first, then his legs. Then, slowly, the air around him stopped trying to take the warmth from his body and began to give some back. Derek stood very still for a moment and let the warmth arrive. "Oh," he said. "Oh, you absolute genius." She had gotten to her feet and was looking around the hab with the same systematic inventory expression she'd had from the moment she walked in, cataloging what was there and what wasn't and what might be useful. She registered his reaction, and there was a shift in her face, something small and satisfied, quickly suppressed, the expression of a person who appreciates being appreciated but hasn't decided yet whether to show it. "Thank you," he said. He put both hands together, a gesture that on most of the worlds he'd worked on meant something in the range of asterisk gratitude and hoped it translated. "Seriously, thank you." She looked at his hands, looked at his face, said something brief that had the rhythm of a response to gratitude. Not "you're welcome" exactly, but something in the territory of it was necessary or of course. I know," he said, as though he understood because it seemed like the right thing to say. She moved to the far bunk and sat on it, not with the deliberate care of someone claiming territory, but with the simple practicality of someone choosing the most logical available position. She pulled her hood back completely and tilted her head slightly, and appeared to be listening to something he couldn't hear, the wind, maybe, or something beyond the wind. He noticed the cord at her throat again. Up close it was finer than he'd thought, more like a braided filament, tied in a knot so precise it looked engineered rather than tied. She touched it once with 2 fingers, not adjusting it, just checking it was there. He sat on his own bunk, which was the one directly across from hers, and pulled the thermal blankets back over himself. The heat unit was working, but the hab was still cold enough that blankets mattered, and the cold of the previous hours had gotten into him in the deep way that cold does when it has had long enough to work, sitting in the joints and the center of the chest, and the particular tiredness behind the eyes that comes from a body that has spent too long doing the arithmetic of survival. He watched her. She was not cold. He couldn't tell how he knew this, but he was certain of it. Her posture didn't have the micro-contractions of a body conserving heat, and she hadn't asked for any of the blankets, and she was sitting in her exoskeletal layer with the easy stillness of someone whose thermal situation was fine. More than fine, he thought. She radiated something. Even from across the hab with both of them still and the heat unit working, he could feel it. Not body heat exactly, more like the heat that comes off a machine running at full efficiency, a warmth that was purposeful rather than incidental. It made him wonder what the cord at her throat was actually doing. Whether limiter asterisk was the right word for it, or whether it was more like a valve, something that controlled a pressure that would otherwise build to the point of being difficult to contain. He thought about this, and then stopped thinking about it because it was not his business, and she had not offered the information. "So," he said, "are there more of you out there?" She looked at him. "Other your people, out in the storm?" Nothing, not because she didn't hear him, because she was deciding whether to answer. After a moment she said something, and the tone was, he cataloged this carefully, resigned, like answering a question she'd hoped not to be asked. "Okay," he said, "you don't have to explain." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, and then looked away. The hab warmed. It took about 40 minutes to get from -11 to something his body stopped interpreting as emergency, and during that 40 minutes they were quiet with each other in the way that strangers are quiet when they're sharing a confined space and haven't worked out the grammar of the situation yet. He found his emergency ration pack and ate half of it without enthusiasm. He held the other half out toward her and gestured, the universal asterisk, "Do you want some?" She looked at it, looked at him, and shook her head once, which was either no asterisk or a gesture that happened to look like asterisk no and meant something else entirely. He ate the rest. He tried to sleep. He was tired enough. 14 months of early shifts and cold and isolation tired, the kind that lived in the bones. He lay back on the bunk and pulled the blankets up and closed his eyes and listened to the wind and the heat unit and the small sounds of another living thing occupying the same space. Sleep didn't come. After about 20 minutes he opened his eyes and she was still sitting exactly where she'd been, but she was looking at the ceiling now with an expression that he recognized despite the alien geometry of her face, because expressions of unquiet memory are among the most legible things a face can do across species boundaries. The set of the jaw, the eyes not seeing what's in front of them, the slight downward pull at the corners of the mouth that means I am somewhere else right now, and where I am is not pleasant. "Hey," he said quietly. She refocused, looked at him. "You okay?" She held his gaze for a long moment and then looked back at the ceiling. Then she said something, and the tone was different from anything she'd said before, lower, slower, with a cadence that had the shape of an explanation or a story even without the words. He lay back and listened to it anyway. It was about 4 sentences long and ended on what sounded like a question but might not have been. He didn't understand any of it. He paid attention to the shape of it anyway, the way you would in music, and when she stopped he said, quietly, "Yeah, I know what that's like." She looked at him. He looked at the ceiling. "I had a sister," he said, "younger than me by 4 years. She came out to the outer stations when I did different station. We weren't in the same crew, but same corridor, same cluster." He paused. There was a standard pause in this story that he'd gotten very good at managing. He managed it. The Verk outbreak. You probably don't know about the Verk outbreak. It was 3 years ago. There was an alien pathogen, not like your kind. I don't mean just a microbe, a fast-moving one, and it hit the corridor before anyone had time to quarantine it properly. He stopped. She was 23. Silence the wind. He hadn't told anyone that in about 8 months. He'd told it often in the first year, the way you do, trying to find words that fit the shape of it, and then less often, and then not at all, and the not telling of it had become its own thing. She was very still across from him. She was listening with a quality of attention that he could feel even without looking at her, the way you can feel someone's full attention like a physical presence. "Anyway," he said, "that's why I'm out here, I think, on a moon at the end of the Jeevith corridor with nobody around." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, easier than staying where everyone kept looking at me like I was still the man whose sister died. He looked over at her. She was watching him with those large honey-dark eyes, and her expression had changed again, and what was in it now was something he recognized without any translation required at all. "You too," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked down at her own hands, said something, one word repeated twice like a name. "Yeah," he said, "I know." They were quiet for a while after that. The hab was warm now, properly warm, and outside the blizzard was still working through its agenda with methodical violence, and neither of them was in danger of dying anymore, at least not tonight. It was, Derek thought, one of the stranger situations of his life, which was saying something because his life had included the Verk outbreak and 18 months on Duran 6, where the native fauna had strong opinions about humans with equipment packs. He must have slept. He wasn't sure when it happened. One moment he was looking at the ceiling and thinking about nothing in particular, and the next he was waking up because something had changed. It was the cold. The heat unit had stopped again. He sat up and the hab was dark. His suit lamp had powered down to standby, and the cold was immediate and muscular, the kind that had claws in it. He fumbled for his lamp and got it lit and checked the heat unit, and the fuel cell was still seated, but the element was dark. "No," he said, in the specific tone of a man who has been through too much already today to take this development calmly. "No, no, no." He was working on the unit, hands already going clumsy with the cold when she appeared at his shoulder. He hadn't heard her move. She looked at the unit, pressed the recessed switch, got nothing. She pressed it again, held it for 3 seconds, nothing. She looked at the element and said something short and sharp that had exactly the quality of a profanity, and then she stood back. "Can you fix it?" he asked. She looked at him, shook her head. "Okay," he said, "okay." He went to his thermal blankets and wrapped them around himself and sat back on the bunk and did the math again. The math was not better than it had been the first time. Without the heat unit, the hab would be at -20 within 3 hours and dropping. He was dressed for -20 with a heat unit providing backup warmth. Without the unit, -20 was where he crossed from uncomfortable into medically concerning, and the curve went down from there. She was standing in the center of the hab looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, but there was something urgent in the line of her posture. She said something, direct, measured like an instruction. "I don't understand you," he said. She said it again, and then came to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the faint iridescence in her skin shifting in the lamplight, and she reached out and touched the cord at her throat, the blue filament, the one she'd checked with 2 fingers when she first sat down, and held his gaze and said something that sounded like it began with if asterisk. He watched her hands. She touched the cord again, then held her own arms and made a gesture he understood. Cold. Then she pointed at the bunk, at his blankets, at herself, at him. He stared at her. Are you saying what I think you're saying?" She looked at him steadily. "You want to share?" He gestured at the bunk, the blankets. "For warmth." She said something that had the rhythm of asterisk, obviously. "Yes, this is not complicated." Okay, I hear you, this is a lot to process while I'm freezing." She raised one eyebrow in a way that communicated, across every language barrier, the concept of then process faster. He looked at the broken heat unit. He looked at the blankets. He looked at her, at the golden iridescence and the 2 large eyes, and the cord at her throat that she kept touching like a talisman or a limiter or something she needed to know was still in place. "Okay," he said. "Okay, yeah, you're right, this is just practical." He moved over on the bunk. She settled in beside him with the efficiency of someone solving a problem rather than making a social overture, which he found, paradoxically, reassuring. She was not performing comfort or performing indifference. She was simply occupying the available space in the available time with the pragmatic directness of a person for whom survival tasks did not carry social anxiety. He found this genuinely calming. He was too cold and too tired for social anxiety himself. He pulled the blankets over both of them, 3 thermal blankets. Not enough for -20 alone, but for 2 people generating body heat, it was a different calculation, and the calculation came out better. And he filed this fact under things that are true about the universe asterisk. Alongside asterisk, loose couplings will always fail eventually, and the math changes when you're not doing it alone. She was warmer than he was. He noticed this immediately. She ran hot, significantly hotter than a human body, closer to a fever temperature than a normal resting temperature. And the warmth of her through the layers of his clothing was immediate and substantial and profound in the way that warmth is profound when you've been cold long enough to forget that you're supposed to be warm. like walking out of a pressurized corridor into open air, and suddenly remembering that air can smell like things. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Outside, the wind continued its project, the systematic dismantling of any warmth it could reach, and inside the hab the thermal blankets held what they could hold and her warmth made up the difference. He stopped shivering. He hadn't realized he'd been shivering until it stopped. After a few minutes she made a sound, very quiet, not quite a word, more like an involuntary exhalation, and he realized she was relaxing in the way a body relaxes when it's been holding something taut for a long time and finally lets go. He understood that. He knew exactly what it was like to hold something taut all day through the performance of competence and steadiness that work required, and then in the dark, when there was nothing left to perform for, let it go. He'd been doing it for 3 years. The letting go in the dark was the only part that was real. "You're safe," he said quietly. He wasn't sure why he said it. It seemed like the right thing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that he didn't understand, but the tone of it was not quite thank you. Something more complicated. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as I didn't expect this, and possibly also in the neighborhood of I'm not accustomed to it, but I'm not objecting. He thought about that for a while, in the dark, with the wind outside and the cold pressing against the hab walls and her warmth pressed against his side like a pilot light in a cold room, the essential small thing that keeps the larger system from failing. "Me neither," he said. He slept. When he woke, the hab was dim with the gray light of Tavon's day filtering through the small port window above the bunk, which meant the storm had reduced enough to let some light through. He was warm. He was aware, before he opened his eyes, that he was warm in a way that had nothing to do with blankets and everything to do with proximity. She was awake. He could tell from her breathing, the quality of breath changes between sleep and waking, that slow evenness becoming something more deliberate. He opened his eyes, and she was lying beside him looking at the ceiling with an expression he was beginning to be able to parse. It was the same expression she'd had the first night when she'd been somewhere else in her memory, but there was something different about it now, something that sat between the memory and the present and was making space for the present to exist. "Morning," he said. She turned her head and looked at him, and there was, briefly and without any apparent intention, something almost like a smile in the corner of her mouth. Not a full smile. The beginning of one. "Good morning to you too," he said. She said something, the same word she'd said the night before when he'd offered her his name. The same soft consonant, the same long mid-vowel. He turned it over in his head, trying to get his mouth around the shape of it. "May," he said. She looked at him for a beat and then looked back at the ceiling, and this time the not-quite smile was more visible. They lay there while the light came up through the port window, and the storm sound changed from the full-throated roar of the night to something more subdued and tired, the way storms sound when they've worked through most of their anger. "The cord," he said after a while. She didn't move, listening. "You keep touching it. Does it hurt? Are you okay?" She turned her head, looked at him. Then she reached up and touched it, and this time she didn't let go of it immediately. She said something, deliberate and measured, and then she reached out and took his hand with 2 fingers and placed it very lightly against her sternum over her heart and held it there. Her heart was beating. He could feel it through the layers of clothing, faster than human but steady, a rhythm with a sound beneath it, a faint resonance, like a vibration in a metal structure when something warm passes through it. She took his hand away after a moment, said something. He looked at her. "You're not entirely," he started. He stopped. He thought about the cord, the limiter it seemed to represent, the way she ran fever-hot, the way she'd moved when she came through the door, the inhuman quickness of it that he'd registered and filed away. "You're not entirely what I'd call standard," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "That's okay," he said. "I've been called non-standard myself." She made a sound. It took him a moment to realize it was a laugh. It was brief, and it surprised her more than it surprised him. He saw the surprise in her face, the faint widening of those amber eyes, as if her own laughter was something she'd met unexpectedly. She recovered quickly, composed herself, but the composed expression didn't fully take, and what was underneath it was still there, something lighter than what had been there before. "Tell me something," he said. "You don't have to, but tell me something in your language and I'll just listen." She studied him for a moment. Then, unhurried, she began to speak. It was longer than what she'd said the night before. He had the impression of a narrative, something with a beginning and a progression, and a place where the tone dropped, and a place where it climbed back. He listened to it the way he listened to music in languages he didn't speak, following the emotional arc without the words, tracking the shape rather than the content. He had learned, in 14 months of outer corridor work, that the outer corridor had a way of stripping language down to its emotional skeleton. There wasn't much a person could say in the face of the kind of distances and silences out here that didn't eventually reduce to something universal. He thought he could hear in it something about distance, and something about loss, and something about a decision made in a moment when no good choice was available. The kind of decision that was not wrong and not right, but simply the only door left in the room. He thought he could hear something about a name given and a name taken, and he thought about ***, nameless, and wondered if all names given in place of real names contained the same grief, and a person who'd taught her to fight and a person she'd trusted, and the difficult territory between those two things when they turned out to be the same person, as they so often did. He thought he could hear the specific fatigue of someone who had been strong for a long time, in a context that did not have room for anything else, and the strangeness of being somewhere that had room. He was probably projecting. He was definitely projecting. But the projection had a weight to it that felt like contact, like two things finding an edge they could fit against, and the fitting together was not neat or clean, but it was real, which was better than neat. When she stopped, she was looking at the ceiling again. He was looking at her. "Okay," he said, "my turn." He told her about the Jivith corridor, about the mining consortium and the 14 months and the reason he'd transferred out here to the farthest survey point in the cluster. Not the brief version he'd given the night before, but the full version, the one with the texture in it. Lyra's laugh, which was louder than you'd expect from someone so careful about everything else. The way she'd gotten genuinely enthusiastic about the geology of outer system moons, in a way that he'd teased her for, and then privately started reading about himself, just so he'd have something to talk to her about when they caught each other on a comm channel on off days. The last conversation they'd had, which had been about nothing important, a scheduling thing, and how he was still grateful for that. That the last thing they'd talked about had been ordinary, because the ordinary conversations were the ones that proved you thought you'd have more time. She listened the entire time. She didn't look away. When he finished, they were both quiet. The storm outside had diminished to something that might generously be called light weather by Tavon standards. The port window was showing actual sky, gray and cloud-churned, but sky. "She would have liked you," he said, "for what it's worth." She said something. "Yeah." She said it again, slightly differently, and he had the overwhelming impression that it was *Y. She always had a thing for people who walked into broken situations and started fixing them, he said. "You're that type." Her expression was unreadable for a moment, and then it wasn't. They got up in the way people get up in a small shared space, navigating around each other with the practiced unconsciousness of people who have spent a night in proximity and worked out where the other person is without thinking about it. She checked the broken heat unit again, disassembled something, looked at the element and said something that sounded conclusive about its prospects. He ate the remaining half of one emergency ration. He offered her some again. She took a piece this time, a small one, looked at it, put it in her mouth with the expression of someone conducting an experiment. chewed, made a face. "Yeah," he said, "I know they're terrible." She said something that had the texture of, "Then why do you eat them?" "Because they contain everything my body needs to function, and the engineers who designed them decided flavor was not a survival-critical parameter." She looked at the remaining ration, and then looked at him with an expression of dignified sympathy. "Don't feel sorry for me," he said. "I'm used to it." She made the not quite laugh again, the one she clearly wasn't planning to make, but that happened anyway. He found himself trying to memorize it, the way it looked on her face, not because of anything in particular, just because it was a good thing, and the habit of cataloging good things was one he'd developed in the last 3 years as a form of discipline against the other direction, the direction where you started counting losses instead of things worth keeping. He checked his comm unit. The storm had dropped enough that the signal was getting through partially. He had 2 automated messages from base camp, the second one updating the rescue ETA to *12-18 HRS instead of *18-24*, which was progress, and a manual message from his sector supervisor named Brecht, who had the personality of a fire hazard and who had apparently filed the incident report himself, and added a note that read in full, "Voss, try not to die. I don't want the paperwork." Derek read this, decided it was affection in the only register Brecht was capable of, and put the comm down. "They're coming," he said. He pointed at the comm, then at the door, then raised his hands in a shrug that meant in some hours. She nodded once. He looked at her. She was standing by the port window, looking out at the gray-churned sky over the Caranova Ridge, and the light from the window was finding the iridescence in her skin and making it shift between amber and gold, and something that didn't have a name in his color vocabulary. "Will I see you again?" he asked. He kept his voice neutral when he said it, the way you do when you're not sure if you want the answer to be yes or no, or whether the question means anything at all. She turned from the window. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached up and touched the blue filament cord at her throat. This time she untied it. He watched her hands, 1 knot, 2 knots, an engineered twist that released when she found the right angle. The cord came free. She held it for a moment, looking at it, and then she held it out to him. He took it. It was lighter than he'd expected, finely made. The filament had a warmth to it that was probably absorbed body heat and was probably not anything more than that. "What does it?" he started. She said something, 2 words, and then touched her own sternum over her heart in the place where she'd put his hand earlier. "It's yours," he said, "not a question." She tilted her head in a way that meant it was. "And now it's mine." She said something. He held it and looked at it and thought about what it meant to be given something that belongs to the place between what you were and what you are. "I'll keep it safe," he said. She looked at him. The something in her expression was not unreadable now. It was very readable. He was reading it. "Yeah," he said, "me too." They were quiet for a while after that. She sat on the bunk. He sat on his. They were close enough that if either of them reached out they would have touched, and neither of them reached out, and the space between was not a distance but a held thing, like the breath before a word. He found his tools and started working on a panel that had been bothering him since the HAB was first established. A loose conduit coupling that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the fact that he was a maintenance technician, and leaving a loose coupling in a conduit panel was the kind of thing that itched at the base of his skull. He was that kind of person. Lyra had called it a pathology, and he'd argued it wasn't a pathology. It was a philosophy, and she'd said those were the same thing with better lighting. She watched him work from her place on the bunk, not with boredom, not with polite tolerance, with the kind of attention that people give to things they find genuinely interesting, the leaned-in quality of someone who is learning something and knows it. He narrated while he worked, for no particular reason other than that it felt less strange than silence, explaining each step in terms she couldn't understand. And she listened with the same quality of attention she'd had when he was telling her about Lyra, the whole body listening that was rare in any species as far as he'd observed, and that he'd always found disarming. The way a very good listener made you say more than you intended, because the silence they offered at the end of your sentences had a quality that asked to be filled. "This coupling's been loose for 3 months," he said. "I flagged it in the maintenance report and Brecht said it wasn't priority." He was technically right. Loose coupling in a secondary conduit panel isn't going to cause an immediate failure event. But he was also wrong in a way that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't understand that most catastrophic system failures start as minor annoyances that someone decided weren't priority. A mining consortium did a study on it. 43% of critical failures on outer corridor installations had a flagged minor issue in the same system in the 90 days prior. Brecht knows this. He's worked for the same company for 22 years. He's the kind of man who can hold 2 contradictory things in his head simultaneously and not be bothered by it, which I find either impressive or disturbing depending on the day. She said something. "Exactly," he said. He wasn't sure what she'd said, but exactly seemed like the right response to whatever it was. He found the coupling, fitted the tool around it, applied the torque with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has tightened enough couplings to know that haste gets you nowhere in this particular task. The threading caught. He turned it the last quarter rotation. The coupling seated with a solid click that was deeply, disproportionately satisfying in the way that correct mechanical sounds always were, the sound of a system returning to the state it was supposed to occupy. She made a sound that was approval, short, satisfied, the sound a person makes when something goes the way it should. "Thank you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I'm serious. It's good to have someone appreciate the work. Nobody out here appreciates the maintenance work. They notice it when it fails and they don't notice it when it works, which is the nature of maintenance work everywhere, and I accepted that when I took the job. But it's good when someone looks at a coupling seating correctly and makes that sound." She said something longer, and he could hear the arc of a joke in it, a setup, and then a drop that had the rhythm of a punchline, something about the coupling or about him, probably gently at his expense, though he couldn't know for certain, and he laughed, genuinely, without knowing what she'd said, because the rhythm of the joke was enough. She looked at his laugh the way she'd looked at her on the first time, surprised by it as though it had arrived unexpectedly, and then not unhappy about the surprise. Not unhappy at all. When the hours had passed, and the sky outside the port window had gone from gray to the pale amber that was Tavon's version of afternoon, his comm unit lit up with a signal. The rescue crawler was 20 minutes out. He listened to the confirmation, acknowledged it, and sat for a moment with the comm in his hands. She was watching him. 20 minutes, he said. He held up 2 fingers, then gestured at the door, then mimed a vehicle arriving. She understood. He could tell she understood. She stood, and she reached for her hood, pulling it up with the efficiency of someone readying to move. "You don't have to go," he said. She looked at him. "I mean, they might be, I don't know how they'd react, the rescue crew. But they're just mining consortium workers. They're not. Nobody out here gets to be scared of things they've never seen before. It's one of the first things you learn in the outer corridor. You either get comfortable with strange or you go work somewhere else." He stopped. He was talking too much. "I'm just saying, you don't have to go out in the cold again on my account." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said something, and it was the most she'd said at once, the most complete thing she'd said, and he listened to every syllable of it. The tone had more registers in it than anything she'd said before. He couldn't parse the words, and he could parse every single thing that mattered. The acknowledgement of something that had happened that she hadn't expected, the statement of something that would continue to be true in its absence, the question that sat at the end of it that wasn't quite hoping for an answer, but was leaving space for one anyway. "Yeah," he said, "for what it's worth, likewise." She nodded once, short, precise. She moved to the door. Her hand was on the handle, and she paused there for a moment with the quality of someone who has something more to say and is deciding whether to say it. He waited, the way you wait when you can tell a person is making a decision, and any sound from your direction will tip the scales the wrong way. "May," he said. She stopped, turned her head slightly, not all the way, enough. He held up the blue filament cord. He had wrapped it once around his wrist since she'd placed it in his hand, loose enough to slide off, secure enough to stay, the way you secure something you intend to keep without making the keeping look like a claim. She looked at it. Then she looked at him fully, without the evaluating quality she'd had in the first hours of knowing him, without the careful neutrality of someone deciding how much to show. She just looked at him. And this time, fully and without being suppressed before it could begin, she smiled. It was a remarkable thing. Wide enough to show teeth, which were largely as he expected teeth to look, and bright enough to change the whole architecture of her face, the amber eyes going warm and the particular dignity of her expression opening into something unguarded and real. He looked at it. He knew, with the certainty of a person who understands value, that it was not given freely to everyone. He understood that the correct response was to look at it without looking away, without embarrassment, without deflection. Just acknowledge it the way you acknowledge a gift. He nodded once. She turned back to the door. He filed the smile with the other things worth keeping, which was a list he had been building for 3 years, and which had not always been easy to populate, and which was, this morning, longer than it had been yesterday. The door opened. The wind came in, diminished now, cold but not killing cold, the kind of cold that just meant this is a difficult place, and you knew that when you chose to come here, the honest cold of a place that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She stepped through it without looking back, which he understood was not dismissal but a form of assurance. The backward glance was for people who weren't sure they'd find their footing, and she found her footing. The door sealed. He sat in the hab with the warm air and the loose cord around his wrist, and the faint residual warmth on the bunk where she'd been, and he waited for the sound of the rescue crawler. When it came, the low diesel grumble, the creak of the suspension on the ice-hardened track, he stood up and straightened his jacket and breathed out and breathed in. He was still cold. He was fine. Brecht was in the passenger seat of the crawler, which was unusual. Brecht was not a man who went out in field conditions if he could avoid it. He had the expression of someone who had done something he didn't want to do and was waiting to be thanked for it. Dirk climbed in and the crawler turned and started the long drive back to base camp along the ridge road, and Brecht said, without preamble, "So the automated HAB report says the heat unit went twice." "Yeah. How'd you survive the second one?" Dirk looked out at the Caranova Ridge, at the slope still white and the sky going pale amber toward the west. "I had help," he said. Brecht looked at him. "It was fine," Dirk said. "Everything was fine." Brecht made the sound of a man filing something under things I've decided not to ask about, and they drove in silence for a while, which was the most comfortable kind of silence there was, the kind between people who understood each other well enough to be quiet together. On Dirk's wrist, the blue filament cord caught the low afternoon light and held it. He thought about what she'd said in the last moment before the door. He thought about the way the answer to an impossible question sometimes wasn't an answer at all but a willingness to remain in the uncertainty of the question, and about how that willingness was itself a thing made of something. Not faith exactly, not knowledge exactly, something more like the quiet stubbornness of a person who has decided that the alternative to not knowing is not better than not knowing, and who has therefore decided to sit in the open space and look at it without flinching. He thought about Lyra, who would have had extremely strong opinions about all of this, delivered with the volume she didn't know she had, and who would have been right. The crawler came down off the ridge road, and the lights of base camp came up in the early amber dusk, a loose cluster of pressurized modules and antenna arrays in crawler bays, the human footprint on a moon that had been cold for 100,000 years before anyone came to look at it, and would be cold for 100,000 years after they'd gone. He looked at it. 14 months, and it still had the quality of temporary about it, the way any place you're not sure you intend to stay has that quality. He looked at the cord on his wrist. Maybe he'd stay a while longer. Brecht pulled up to the main hab and killed the engine, and did the standard post-field checkout with the clipboard he carried on a lanyard because he had never fully trusted digital systems, which was one of the things Dirk had always privately respected about him. The checkout took 4 minutes. Dirk waited. "You look different," Brecht said finally, without looking up from the clipboard. "I nearly froze to death. That'll change a man." "Not that." Brecht looked up. He studied Dirk the way a person studies something they've been looking at for a long time and are seeing for the first time. "You look like you." He stopped. He was not a man who had practiced completing sentences like that. He went back to the clipboard. "Get some food and sleep," he said. "You're on maintenance rotation, day after tomorrow. There's a loose conduit coupling in the hab at Curl 7 that I already fixed. I'll add it to the log." "Was?" "Yeah." "Good," Brecht said. "That you're back." Dirk looked at him. Brecht was looking at the clipboard with the focused attention of a man reading the same line for the 3rd time without seeing it. "Yeah," Dirk said. "Good to be back." He got out of the crawler. The cold hit him, the settling-in cold of Tavon's evening, and he stood in it for a moment and let it be what it was: cold, present, particular. The kind of specific cold that belongs to a specific place and means you are there and nowhere else. He went inside. He made tea, which he was almost out of and would have to order more on the next supply run. He sat at the small table in the common module with the mug in both hands, and looked at nothing in particular and thought about things in the unhurried way you can think when you have been afraid, and are no longer afraid, and have come out the other side with something you didn't have before, though you can't yet name what it is. The blue cord was still on his wrist. He touched it with the fingers of his other hand. The warmth in it was gone, the absorbed body heat long since dissipated, but the material itself held something, a texture, a weight. He didn't try to explain what it held. Some things were best understood the way he'd understood her voice in the dark, following the shape of it, the arc and the intention, and the place where it opened toward something that wasn't yet named but was present. Outside, Tavon's night came down clean and hard and full of stars, the way it always did after a major weather event, as though the storm had cleared everything cluttered from the sky. He knew the names of about 1/3 of the visible stars from this latitude. He'd learned them from Lyra's notes, which he'd found on his comm unit after the Verk outbreak, a file labeled * Outer Corridor Star Guide, incomplete, that she'd been building in her off hours, methodical as she always was, with annotations like * Dirk will like this one because it's a binary and he's going to ask if that's better or worse, and the answer is it's both. He'd never been able to delete the file. He'd also never been able to open it without closing it again after the 3rd entry. Tonight he opened it and read it through to the end. Lyra had gotten to 72 stars. He looked up at the window and found the one she described as both, the double star system in the lower quadrant that pulsed slightly if you watched it long enough, the light from 2 things so close together they read as one. He watched it for a while. The cord on his wrist. He thought about what it meant to be something in between grief and the absence of grief, between alone and not alone, between the person you were when you came to a hard place, and the person you were after you came through a harder night than you'd expected and found on the other side of it that warmth was not the same as safety and safety was not the same as warmth, and the difference between them was exactly the size of a person you hadn't expected to meet. He finished the tea. He checked the station's weather monitors, clear for the next 36 hours. He went to bed. He slept deeply, for the first time in 3 years, without the particular category of dream that had been his steadiest company since Lyra. When he woke at 600 to the cold amber light of Tavon's sunrise, he lay there for a moment in the quiet and understood that something had shifted in the specific way that things shift when a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it was weight gets set down. He got up. He made coffee. He added the conduit repair at Curl 7 to the maintenance log. He drafted the request for his resupply order, including 2 full boxes of tea, and on impulse, a small item from the agricultural module catalog, a seedling starter kit for one of the cold-tolerant grain varieties that had been developed for outer system habitation, the kind of thing that had no practical value on an individual survey assignment, and had been on his asterisk someday maybe list for the entire 14 months. He ordered it. At 8:42, his comm unit received a message that was not voice, not text, but a short audio burst musical in structure, 5 tones falling and rising and falling again, the same shape as a question that was also a statement, the same shape as something he'd listened to in the dark of the hab with the wind outside. He did not have the software to decode it, or the linguistic training to interpret it. He listened to it 6 times. He set the comm down. He looked at the cord on his wrist, and then at the double star in the lightening sky beyond the port window, pulsing faintly, 2 things reading as one. "Yeah," he said, to the room, to the window, to the appropriate distance. "Me too." He put on his jacket and went to do the morning systems check, which was a practical and necessary task that had to happen regardless of everything else, because out in the far corridor, you learned early that the ordinary tasks were the ones that kept you alive, and keeping alive was the work, and the work was worth doing. The Caranova Ridge stood white and cold and immense against the amber sky, unchanged by anything that had happened in the hab at its foot, as the landscape always is unchanged by what happens inside it. But Dirk Voss, maintenance technician, 31 years old, outpost Curl 7 Tavon, was not unchanged, and he walked the morning systems check with the cord on his wrist and the audio burst in his comm unit and the T order confirmed, and the seedling kit coming on the next supply run, and he thought, this is what it is to be human in the far dark. Not the heroics, not the speeches, not the defiance declared at full volume against the uncaring cosmos. Just this. Still here. Still warm. Still choosing to be.